So we've talked quite a bit about the UNSC's ODSTs, or Orbital Drop Shock Troopers, but we haven't talked a lot about what makes that unit so unique, and that is the SOEIV pod, the single-occupant exo-atmospheric insertion vehicle, which is commonly known as the drop pod. So today I figured we'll take a look at ODST drop pods, how they work, and what makes them so significant within the strategies employed by the UNSC during the Human Covenant War. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, I know we're all familiar with the basics of how an ODST drop pod works. If you've played any Halo game, you've probably seen them. They're the small metal capsules dropped from ships in orbit that deliver single ODSTs to a battlefield. These small pods are what really set the ODSTs apart from other combat units, and while there's a lot of little things from their training to their equipment that distinguish them from other elements of infantry within the UNSC military, nothing really separates them quite as much as their ability to be inserted directly from orbit without the use of a larger vehicle like a Pelican. So today we're going to talk about how these pods work and how they're used by the UNSC. So let's start with the basics of the SOEIV pod. SOEIV is an acronym that stands for Single Occupant Exo-Atmospheric Insertion Vehicle, basically a single-person vehicle designed to insert them from outside of the atmosphere of a planet. It is more or less a reentry capsule that is capable of carrying a single occupant. The lone ODST sits in a seat in the middle of the vehicle facing the door, and mounted to either side of them are their weapons. They're dropped from orbit, usually using a small control thruster to maneuver to where their target is before re-entering Earth's atmosphere or whatever planet they're landing on. Now that's where the first piece of interesting technology tied to the SOEIV pod comes in. The outer layer of the pod is made up of three materials: a ceramic material, a lead fabric material, and a titanium material. The titanium material maintains the shape of the drop pod, the ceramic burns away while it enters the planet's atmosphere, and the lead-lined fabric keeps the whole thing together. All this means that the insertion pod survives re-entry in most cases, and is able to be navigated towards its target. But there is a downside to this armor setup: it's not very effective against basically any kind of projectiles. So it's very easy for anti-air installations to take down these pods with single hits. The trick is just hitting them. They're small targets, usually moving pretty fast. As the pods get closer to the ground, they deploy a metal element from the top of the vehicle, which operates like a drogue chute, slowing it down slightly as it approaches the ground, and within those last 50 meters or so, a series of landing engines are fired to slow the pod until it sets down gently on the ground. Now, this is a very abrupt and shocking impact, and usually the trooper has to then jump from the pod and directly into combat. The nature of the way ODSTs are used within the UNSC means that they are often falling into hotter combat zones and have to be able to enter combat far quicker than other infantry units. Which brings us to how these pods were actually used. Now, the SOEIV pod is used for a variety of different roles within the deployment of ODSTs and a variety of different situations that you'd want to drop ODSTs into, but the most practical and most common way is to open a second front against an enemy that already holds ground on the surface of a planet. This would be carrying out usually a first strike with the goal that the ODSTs would clear a landing area for a larger element of, say, UNSC Marines, which may be able to bring in heavier weapons. That being said, the ODSTs aren't without heavy weapons and light vehicles themselves, because the SOEIV pod, while the name is single occupant, is actually capable of carrying equipment as well. The seats could be removed, and that space could be taken up by a single mongoose, a light reconnaissance vehicle, or a variety of different heavy weapons platforms, from mounted machine guns to Shiva missile pods, which allow ODST units to be able to deploy a significant amount of firepower even without the support of a larger infantry element like a Marine armored unit, for example. As for what equipment the SOEIV pod has, it varies quite a bit. The pod itself has no weapons and no defenses, but it can have a variety of different weapons stored inside of it. Basically, any infantry weapon fielded by the UNSC can be stored in one of these pods. Most infantry weapons can be stored in one of these pods along with the occupant. Like I mentioned, some things, like heavier mounted machine guns, would have to be assigned to pods of their own, but in most cases, most small arms for the infantry could be loaded in either side of the pod and then accessed by the troopers once the pod had landed. The pod itself also has a pretty complex communication suite that allowed the pods to talk to each other on their way down and communicate with other larger pieces of battle infrastructure to gain tactical awareness about the area that they're dropping into, and some pods within a formation of ODSTs would have additional elements on board, like an additional suite of scanners and tactical communication equipment assigned to the pods of the officers of ODST units, which would be the first ones to reach the ground. Now, while the SOEIV pod is famous for its use within the orbital drop shock troopers, or the ODSTs, they are also used in other elements of the UNSC military. We see these used occasionally by UNSC Special Forces, and occasionally by Spartan program members. Most notably, Spartan 2s tend to prefer this as an insertion method over other methods because it is slightly less vulnerable than a large dropship. Using the SOEIV pod itself, there is a variety of advantages to being able to drop a smaller single-occupant vehicle into a tight space. It allows you to deploy infantry in areas where a larger vessel like a Pelican or an Albatross would be unable to deliver troops, which can be advantageous in situations like urban environments or dense jungles where perhaps dropships are just not a viable option. That being said, SOEIV drops are notoriously dangerous. Well, they often did go according to plan. If anything failed in the process, the individual ODSTs in these pods would likely be killed. And as I mentioned earlier, these pods aren't very heavily armored, so in a drop into a hostile area, it's basically a given that a number of these pods will be shot down, and a number of troopers will die before they can even reach the ground. If the drogue chute or the landing engines fail, the pod will hit the ground at too high a velocity and do what is referred to by the ODSTs as digging its own grave with the occupant inside of it. The soldier would be unable to escape the pod, and if they're not killed on impact, they would likely just die in their pod. All that being said, though, the ODST's SOEIV pods are what really set them apart from other infantry elements, and their method of deployment onto the battlefield is very different from other elements across the UNSC, but that's not the only thing that sets them apart. If you'd like to learn more about the ODSTs and what makes them different from other soldiers within the UNSC and the history of their units, I'll leave a link up here to my video on the ODSTs and the history of the ODST elements within the UNSC military. And I'd like to let me know down in the comments, if you were a soldier in the UNSC military, pretend that you get a choice here, and you have to choose between inserting in a Pelican an armored vehicle that's bigger and slower, but armored, or an unarmored drop pod, what would you pick for going into a hostile combat scenario? And if you have anything else like to see me cover in Halo or anywhere else in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.